The plan for today was to make a video about Chuck Wendig and his attack on Star Wars fans. When I made my video yesterday about the whole UKIP stunt, one thing I never expected to have to do was to defend the idea that they were a right-wing party, and quite a far right-wing party. I knew there'd be pushback, I knew people would disagree with me, I knew people would be lolling and trolling in the comments and generally being quite triggered, but I never thought anyone would contest the idea that they're right-wing. And yet, here we are. I could understand why they might unconvincingly contest whether it was racist or far-right, but not the simple and obvious notion that they are a right-wing party. As we can see clearly from the political compass, they're firmly on the right wing, very marginally closer to the centre on the left-right axis than our current far-right conservative government, but also more authoritarian. This placing is based on their 2017 general election manifesto and public statements from their leadership around that time. They also produced a mini manifesto for the 2018 local elections, but the 2017 one seems to be the best point of comparison between the parties for now. I've belaboured, pun intended, the definitions and meanings of left-wing, socialist and so on, but have spent less time on the right. So let's address that now, both in the specific case of UKIP and more generally. Like left-wing, the term right-wing goes back to the French Revolution and the seating arrangements. Those who sat on the left were the radicals, reformers and progressives, while those who sat on the right supported tradition, continuity and the monarchy. Right-wing is a pretty loose term, just as left-wing is, but it involves some collection of the following: conservative and authoritarian doctrines about civil society with an emphasis on custom, traditionalism, nationalism and allegiance. A political basis of obligation, a demand for obedience, ideas of legitimacy and piety rather than contracts, social and otherwise, consent, and ideas of justice. A tendency to conflate legality and morality, and to see the law as a way to enforce notions of morality rather than being independent to it, a route by which religious laws often make their way into being enforced by the state. All people's freedoms get denied on the basis of moral judgment. A tendency to hold individual rights to do something over collective rights from something. A tendency to believe with almost missionary zeal in the absolute benefits of free markets and a capitalist economy, even taken to extremes. A belief in human imperfection, and rather than attempting to compensate for or to address that problem of imperfection, to embrace these imperfections. Some of these ideas can stem from religious or culturally religious beliefs about original sin. There are, of course, paradoxes and conflicts within these beliefs, but conservative, right-wing beliefs need only meet a preponderance of these in order to be considered right-wing. So, let's take a look at UKIP's 2017 manifesto. One of the first and most immediately striking things about UKIP is their constant use of British iconography, the flag, the lion, red, white and blue, and so forth. Nationalism is more strongly associated with the right than the left, while internationalism is more associated with the left than the right, and globalism is more associated with libertarian economics. This isn't a slam dunk, but this call to tradition, symbolism and emotion is much more commonly found on the right. The nationalist element is much more firmly planted in the right when you consider that UKIP are very much the authors of our current misfortune. Their misguided and dishonest campaign against the European Union has ripened into bitter fruit, and much of that on the back of jingoistic nationalism and nostalgia for empire, along with a completely unrealistic view of an independent Britain's prospects in the current world order. Blaming the other in terms of race or creed tends to be the province of the right as well, while blame internally, in terms of class, wealth and so on, is more the province of the left, and it must be said far more convincingly. However, this blame of self is what I believe has manifested in the left in this idea of identity as class, which is much less convincing. This whole pattern has been repeated throughout history, whether it's a hatred of Jews, immigrants or Muslims, and it's apparent that much of UKIP's membership and leadership is, if not racist, at least doing a bloody good impression of racism. We'll come back to that later. They do have some policies which on a surface level are seemingly left-wing, and they have some policies that, at least on paper, I would agree with. They support the NHS, but that's pretty much a given to at least say in UK politics, though the Conservatives are selling it off piecemeal out the back door, and given UKIP's status as essentially the far right of far right conservatism, their relatively libertarian economic position, supporting that, it's unlikely that the NHS would be spared by UKIP. Let's take them at their word though, this is ostensibly more of a left-wing policy than the Conservative Party with whom they should be most commonly compared, but the devil is in the details. They support proportional representation, at least nominally, probably because as a small party they would stand to gain the most from it. Still, I can support that, but I can also support other small parties that desire proportional representation, and even larger parties that support it, without all the baggage that UKIP has. They do correctly address some of the problems with our democracy, and indeed act against it internally, such as having no whip, and advocating for the dissolution of the House of Lords. It's not clear, however, what they would replace that second house with. Their tax reductions that they propose are aimed squarely at the middle class rather than the working class. Their reduction on VAT for domestic bills is something that would genuinely aid the working class, so that is a point in their favour and could be argued to be a left-wing policy. Scrapping tuition fees for STEM subjects would help some of those going to university, but it doesn't address the fundamental problem around higher education that all advanced Western nations are facing. It's also a de facto cut and discouragement from pursuing art, design, creative and humanities subjects. These subjects being a conservative bugbear, in which I agree there are problems, but this is an attempt at social engineering and a devaluing of many of the things the British have traditionally been very good at on the international stage. In that light, punishing some and elevating the useful is a conservative policy. Building new homes, similarly, seems like a good left-wing policy of social investment, but without rolling back Thatcher's reforms, this is at best a temporary fix, and it's hard to envision where these homes would be built. Without further information, it's hard to peg this down as a left or right policy. Placating pensioners with money may again seem like left-wing and a welfare-oriented argument, but this is a traditionally conservative voting bloc, and much of UKIP's support against modernity and internationalism came from this older demographic, so paying them off makes sense. Higher defence spending could, from a certain point of view, be seen as a left-wing policy of social investment, since it spends a lot of government money. But the left traditionally wants to step down defence spending, defence, what a delightful euphemism, and to invest the money in society more. The right takes a more paranoid and militaristic tack, and this, coupled with their proposed higher police spending and numbers, speaks to the right-wing topics of jingoism, nationalism, law, order, tradition, and strength. The dominant factor in the story of UKIP has, of course, been their opposition to the European Union, and this does indeed plant them firmly on the right, Jeremy Corbyn's suicidal refusal to oppose Brexit notwithstanding. The overall tendency is for the right, and the extreme right, to oppose the European project, while the tendency of the left has been to support it as an extension of internationalism. UKIP has been part of right-wing, populist, Eurosceptic groups in the European Parliament since the start, sitting alongside groups like Lega Nord and the Five Star Movement. You can judge them at least a little by the company they keep, I think, and those are unquestionably right-wing. They've stoked and fed resentment and blame improperly, in my opinion, towards Europe and towards immigration, spreading the lie that we don't have control over our immigration and using charged language and vile propaganda images comparing refugees and asylum seekers to vermin and recalling interwar propaganda against marginalised groups. Now, it is true that there are problems around immigration, and merely pointing and screaming racist isn't enough to prove that accusation. Unfortunately, the pseudo-left has made it virtually impossible to have these discussions, and they have overused such accusations and made the use of otherwise useful terminology such as dog whistle hard to justify. That the pseudo-left has fucked up our ability to call out such xenophobia and bigotry doesn't, however, mean that it doesn't exist. There are honest critics, and there are genuine bigots, and the pseudo-left has made it harder, not easier, to separate the wheat from the chaff. But again, back to this later. Bigoted racism or not, anti-immigration, anti-foreigner sentiment is associated with the right, who place a great deal of emphasis on local tradition and the idea that there is some kind of essential, in this case Britishness, that nobody from outside could ever get or understand. This is part of that whole blaming the other. The blue passport debacle, latched onto by the Conservative Party as well and present in UKIP's manifesto, is a great example of national chauvinism and pointless symbolic gesturing. Again, typical of the right. Seeking to invest in and encourage British jobs for British people is all well and good, but we simply cannot make up the shortfall. A very similar set of ideas appeared in the BNP's manifestos year by year when they were engaged in their public relations push. Demography is against us, which is why needs drove us to increase immigration in the first place. This again is part of the blame the other solution, which is typical of the right throughout history. In this case, those being blamed are immigrants, and increased, even licensed hostility has driven many highly qualified European and non-European immigrants working in science and medicine away already. You may think that's a good thing. I do not. Your mileage may vary, but it is characteristic of the right wing. So economically, they're a bit of a mixed bag, though even the policies that you might say are left-wing-ish are tainted by nationalism and nativism. Well, what about social issues then? Here, the right-wing tendency is far more explicit. They decry and call for censorship of newspapers, television, advertising, and more, in language from a culturally conservative position of dignity, but otherwise virtually indistinguishable from the language and claims we know and hate from the sex-negative pseudo-left. They're also in lockstep with the Conservatives' tendency across all party lines in the UK, really, when it comes to censoring the internet and pursuing more prosecutions for trolling and other spurious online behaviour. There's no relief and no home for free speech there. They speak of taking a hardline, zero-tolerance approach to drugs, again a right-wing policy and an authoritarian one, unlike legalisation. They wish to bring back classist grammar schools and to create a two-tier education system, giving up on the poor and underprivileged, even worse than our current system does, and with a fixation on traditionalist education, reading, writing and arithmetic, and against the arts and humanities, when we know a more progressive and less intensive education system, such as that found in Finland, produces better results. This is tradition overriding facts. Employability is also a big focus for them, turning out good little drones for the corporate machine at the expense of aspiration, enjoyment, expertise, variety and interest. You may think that's a good thing, I do not, and again this is a characteristically right-wing position. They have a fixation on the family, the traditional family in particular. This is again a conservative right-wing fixation. This is more social engineering, and there's a presumption of a certain morality here. Lest we forget, UKIP only very grudgingly and very gradually altered its position on same-sex marriage, and candidates for their leadership, even recently, were still saying that they wished to ban same-sex marriage. Their desire to create a single law for everyone, present in this manifesto is laudable, until you start seeing that it is more of an excuse to further demonize immigrant communities. Yes, it should be one law for all, but while they object to, say, Islamic societal norms out of one side of their mouth, they seek to enforce what they consider to be traditional Christian and British values out of the other. That's just exchanging one set of legally and culturally enforced moral restrictions for another set of legally and culturally enforced moral restrictions, while I, and left-wing philosophy as a whole, tends to see law and morality divided and separate. Crime and punishment, as alluded to earlier, is another archly conservative and authoritarian stance for UKIP. They want more people imprisoned, they want more prison officers, and they want to continue the failed conservative tradition of punishment rather than reform. Again, from other nations' examples, we know that fixating on reform and rehabilitation works much better. They want to bring back sus laws, stop and search, the abuse of which by racist police forces such as the Special Patrol Group in the 1980s gave us the Brixton riots. While our police are a lot better and more sensitive now than they were, this would still be disastrous for community relations, especially when coupled with their stated policy of zero tolerance. They even want to take away your drinking by going back to the old chucking out time, another morals by law conservative position. They proudly boast that they want to strip away your human rights and pull us away from the protections of the European Court of Human Rights, something the Conservatives also want to do. Why? Because that will then leave us more open to exploitation by business, more zero-hour contracts, less workers' rights, less protections from the social changes that they want to enforce. Their hatred of internationalism doesn't stop with venom towards the EU. They want to remove all foreign aid as well. Foreign aid being a way of investing in a safer, more developed world in which less people want to leave their countries, which helps stave off migration, terrorism, and other global ills. Investment also creates more customers for your home business in the long term. This is archly conservative, small-minded, nationalistic, and parochial. At this point, we're about done, and I have indeed skimmed over a few things for the sake of brevity, not out of dishonesty. So, if we look back at the loose definition of right-wing we started with, do they meet it? Their zero-tolerance policing policies and moral enforcement by law make it inarguable in my position that they are authoritarian, especially given that these positions are based on tradition and emotion, rather than the black and white facts of what we know works. Obligation? Perhaps not. A demand for obedience? Perhaps via their legalistic enforcement. Ideas of legitimacy? Certainly, with an emphasis on white British identity. And yes, I know those are SJW buzzwords, damn it, but I don't mean it pejoratively, it's an observation. Conflation of legality and morality? Well, there's no question there. Individual rights rather than collective rights? Their nationalism foxes this a little bit and makes it a little bit fuzzy around the edges, but by and large, yes, this is expressed through their business and economic policies. Tendency to believe with almost missionary zeal in capitalism? Yes, even though they're harming the capitalist project to some extent by pulling out of Europe. A belief in human imperfection, and rather than trying to compensate for or to address that problem, to embrace and to punish? Yep, that's found in their prison and policing policies. So taken as a whole, all given, I do not think there is any way that anyone can credibly argue that they're not a right-wing party. And again, if we look to the political compass, they might be very marginally further to the left than the Conservative Party, but they're also a little more authoritarian. Far right? Well, there's not much room left to go to the right, so I think they certainly qualify there. Hanging over all of this, of course, is the implied question of whether that they are racist or not. If they're not racist, they at least seem to attract and to embrace racists, right up until the point they're found out and they have to publicly disavow them. This was happening on an almost weekly basis at one point, right up until they became a political footnote. There was Roseanne Duncan's Negroid features comment. There's common hostility expressed to the very idea of multiculturalism. There was Dave Small, who had to be sacked after just 6 days after complaining about Birmingham being full of jabbering Pakistanis and Somalis wearing pyjamas. There's Godfrey Bloom's infamous Bongo Bongo Land comment. James Elgar thought it would be a merry jape to suggest that all Asians were rapists. William Henry told Lenny Henry to move to a black country if he didn't like it. I mean, it just goes on and on. This stuff isn't made up by the Guardianistas, it's a matter of record and often proudly admitted to by the people being outed. White genocide conspiracy theories, homosexuality as a disease, and these ideas are common, and fuck me, it's getting too depressing to recount them. And if you're seeking to reform this cesspit, more power to you, but I'll believe it when I fucking see it. I described UKIP as the BNP in comfortable shoes. Another way of expressing that might be that if the BNP and the National Front are skinheads, then UKIP is your racist grandpa. The NIMBYism, the parochialism, the nationalism, all of it, very definitely, I'm afraid, plants them on the right. I'm sure there are good people that are members, but you can't deny that they're right-wing. Far right-wing. Zang.
I wish to make a complaint against the Nignog. But equal rights does not entitle Nignogs to move next door. It's them Nignogs next door.